There we go.
As always, if if you have a suggestion, I reserve the right to veto your suggestion. But if there's anything you're interested in studying, book, topic, something like that, just shoot me an email. Again, recognizing I have the right to say no, we're not going to do that. But I still would welcome your suggestions. So just very, very little about this hymn, because I couldn't find a whole lot. The text was written by William Chatterton Dix, who, interestingly, was the son of a poet, and his father named him, the name Chatterton, is the last name of another English poet, an 18th century poet, Thomas Chatterton. And I couldn't find out a whole lot about Thomas Chatterton, except that he had his first works of poetry published when he was 11 years old. So this is not William Dix. This is the name, the guy whose name he bears, Thomas Chatterton. Some of his poetry was political, and apparently his political poetry was not particularly favored. And he actually ended up taking his life at 17 years of age, and he poisoned himself. So there's obviously a tragic story there, and why William's father gave him that name is a mystery to me, but that is where the Chatterton originates. Dix himself was not theologically trained, and I think if you think back to some of these other hymns that we've looked at, certainly hymn writers in the Church of England at the time that he penned this poem, this text. But really, as we've looked at these hymns going back decades and centuries, most of these hymn writers were theologically trained, had some measure of theological training. So this is a little bit atypical, and to my knowledge, this is the only poem that became a hymn text. The only poem of Dix's that became a hymn text. Now, poetry was actually sort of an avocational thing for him. He was in the marine insurance business. He lived in Scotland, so he was an insurance agent. But he became very sick in 1859. And it was during his recovery from this illness, a lengthy recovery, that he penned this, and he penned it on the day of the Feast of the Epiphany, January 6th, 1860, which January 6th is also my mother's birthday. She had an epiphany much later. That would be me on April 17th. But the Feast of Epiphany celebrates the visit of the Magi in the Western tradition. And so Chatterton Dix was recuperating from this illness, reflecting upon this passage in Matthew chapter 2 that we'll look at in just a second. And he penned the first version of what became for us this hymn, As With Gladness Men of Old. Jeff he wanted to call this hymn As With Gladness Old Men, in honor of himself, I think he said. Is this for us? As With Gladness Men of Old. That's just a little bit about this. And again, it is an epiphany hymn. We have this, in the church here, we have this sequence of seasons, and it begins with Advent, those 4 Sundays before Christmas Day, and then the Christmas season is the 12 days of Christmas leading up to Epiphany, the Feast of Epiphany, which again is the celebration of the visit of the Magi, or recognition of the visit of the Magi. So, yea for the wise men. We're going to learn a little bit about the wise men. And their significance. They were Gentiles, right? So And interestingly, as you read the narratives, other than Mary and Joseph and the shepherds, the first persons to come and worship, be described as worshiping the infant Jesus, the young Jesus, were Gentiles. Right? That's kind of an exciting thing for us as Gentiles. So Matthew 2, if you've got a Bible, let me read this passage and we'll talk about it just a little bit. Matthew 2, the first dozen verses. Now, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose, and have come to worship him." When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, "In Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel." When Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared, then Herod summoned the wise men and secretly ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, "Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him." After listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child with Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. Then, opening their treasures, they offered him gifts, gold and frankincense and myrrh. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. So there's quite a lot of drama in this passage. There's some real tensions, which I hope will become clear. But several questions to ask of the text. First, when did this happen? When did this take place? Now, if you put out I'm sure you did, most of us did, if you put out a Christmas creche with Mary and Joseph, I'm sure you know this, but it's worth pointing out again, with Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus and a shepherd and maybe some animals, sheep and a cow and an angel, the angel hanging out there, you probably also put out 3 wise men, right? Be glad that you are in the Western tradition, because in the Western tradition there were 3 wise men. In the Eastern tradition there are 12. You'd have had to put out a whole lot more wise men. You have to have a bigger space for your Christmas creche. But the reality is that they weren't there. I'm sure you know that. The wise men were not there at the nativity, at the birth of Jesus. And there are several things in this text that actually hint at that. The first, in verse 1 of chapter 2, is this little phrase, "after Jesus was born," which suggests that some time has elapsed from the birth of Jesus until the time that these wise men do appear. And then the second thing you'll recognize in verse 11, this should have tipped you off. When they came, verse 11, they went into the house and saw the child with Mary his mother. Now, it's the exact time that has elapsed, We don't know. The third sort of hint that suggests that Jesus could have been as old as 2 years old is in verses 16 to 18 of chapter 2, when Herod becomes enraged because the wise men didn't come back to him. He has all the male children in the vicinity of Bethlehem under 2 years of age murdered, has them killed. The commentaries will tell you that given the size of Bethlehem at the time, there were probably somewhere between a dozen and 30 little boys under the age of 2 who would have been slaughtered at Herod's command. But the fact that he had them, those little boys who could have been as old as 2 years old, suggests that a significant amount of time has elapsed from the very birth of Jesus to the time that the wise men arise. So when did this happen? Probably 12 to 18 months after the birth of Jesus. And by this time, Mary and Joseph, obviously, they're no longer in the barn. They're in, or the feed, where the animals were kept and fed. They, it appears, have taken up somewhat permanent residence in Bethlehem. We know that eventually they do go back to Nazareth. After they go to Egypt, they come back from Egypt. And again, they are warned, Joseph is warned in a dream not to return to Bethlehem. Herod by that time had died, but the area had been kind of divvied up among some successors, and one of those successors posed a real threat to Jesus, and so they end up ultimately in Nazareth. But here they're still in Bethlehem, now in a house, presumably a house of a relative. That's why Joseph took the family to Bethlehem in the first place, because that was the city of David, and he was a lineal descendant of David. So perhaps they had relatives in Bethlehem, but they're back in Bethlehem in a house, and these wise men come to see him. Now, who are these guys? Who are these wise guys? Again, the Western tradition has 3 as the number. The tradition is that their names are Balthazar, Melchior, and Gaspar, but there's no, that identification doesn't show up until the 4th century, 4th or 5th century. So that's just sort of fanciful stuff. We don't know how many there were. I think what we can say is that when they came to Jerusalem, and this is where some of the tension begins to manifest itself, when they came to Jerusalem, they probably came with a fairly sizable entourage. They would have come from the east, from the vicinity of Babylon. That's about 900 miles. The way they would have gotten there was the Fertile Crescent, going up and across the Fertile Crescent and then down these trade routes that existed along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean, and then up into what is now Syria and across to Persia and Babylonia. It would have taken, if they kind of went straight through, it would have taken 20 to 30 miles a day. It would have taken 45, 50 days, a couple of months to get from where they were to Jerusalem. So that would have required supplies, and they probably would have had servants with them. Again, we don't know how many there were, but probably a pretty substantial entourage. And so these foreigners show up. They show up in Jerusalem. It's going to arouse some interest and create some activity. And they get to Herod. Well, you don't just drive into Washington and say, "Hey, I'd like to see the president." You've got to be somebody of influence and importance. And these wise men would have been people of influence, people of importance. They would have been like religious court officials in whatever specific vicinity they came from. They would have been part of a priestly caste. They would have been educated in astrology. They would have been educated in the customs and habits of occupied peoples. They would have had diplomatic training as well as religious training. You remember that these massive empires, whether Assyria or the Babylonians or the Medo-Persians and then the Greeks and the Romans, they occupied all of these lands and occupied all of these peoples. And these wise men, as a part of this sort of religious caste, advisors to whoever their governors and rulers were, would have been familiar with habits and customs of Jewish people. And I think very significantly, you'll remember that there were diaspora Jews scattered all across the east of Jerusalem, which I think plays a significant role here. So who are they? Well, they're these court officials. How did they get here? Jumping down to point D, they got there via the Fertile Crescent. But why did they come? Why did they come? Well, again, the commentators will suggest that given who they were and what they did, they would have been familiar with the Hebrew Bible and would have come in contact, quite probably, with promises that God had made to his people, specifically concerning the promised Messiah, the one who would come and who, when he came, would come as a king and a ruler, and going all the way back to Genesis 3, would come also as a conqueror, would come as a warrior, and his coming would mean the restoration, the beginning of the restoration of shalom, that condition of a pervasive peace and fruitfulness that characterized life before the fall. That's what Messiah would bring with him. Well, one of the promises that shaped the Jewish understanding of the Messiah, who he was, and what he would do, is a promise from Numbers chapter 24. And I've just put a bunch of these passages up here so you can write them down if you want to. So Numbers 24, and this is in that business with Balaam, that whole sequence of things. Don't want to elaborate that right now, Balaam and Balak, but Balaam the prophet takes up his discourse, verse 15, this is his final discourse, and he says, "The oracle of Balaam, the son of Beor, the oracle of the man whose eye is opened, the oracle of him who hears the words of God and knows the knowledge of the Most High, who sees the vision of the Almighty falling down with his eyes uncovered. I see him, but not now. I behold him, but not near. A star shall come out of Jacob, and a scepter shall rise out of Israel." A scepter is the staff of authority, the staff of kingly authority. And then this, "And it shall crush the forehead of Moab and break down all the sons of Sheth. Edom shall be dispossessed. Seir also, his enemies shall be dispossessed. Israel is doing valiantly, and one from Jacob shall exercise dominion and destroy the survivors of cities." Now, some of you have been living with me for 6 years, more than 6 years. And you've heard about Genesis 3:15 more times than you can count. The initial promise that's made, right? "I will put enmity between your seed and her seed." Between the serpent and the seed of the serpent and seed of the woman. "He shall bruise you on the head, you shall bruise him on the heel." This promised seed is going to be a serpent crusher, right? He's going to crush the head. He's going to step on the head of the serpent. In the process, he receives a wound. It's not a mortal wound, as he delivers a mortal wound, right? And you know that that's the cross. You know that at the cross, Jesus crushes the head of the serpent while receiving what appears to be a mortal wound, but because of resurrection, is not a mortal wound, right? Well, you hear this language of Numbers chapter 24. A star shall come out of Jacob, a scepter shall rise out of Israel, ruling authority, kingly authority. And it shall crush the forehead of Moab. And then verse 18, Edom shall be dispossessed. Moab and Edom were these two perennial enemies of Israel, to the east of Israel, to the east of the Dead Sea. What's interesting, and this is where the tension arises, what's interesting is that Herod is an Edomite. He's an Idumean, which is a variant of an Edomite. So he is from this region that is going to be dispossessed by this one who will come and will crush the head of Moab and will exert his kingly rule and reign. Now, I don't know that, I didn't read every commentary on the book of Matthew that has ever been written. But just thinking about this last week, and actually thinking about it this morning, I'm not sure that Herod was as poorly educated as Matthew 2 seems to suggest, because, he gathers all the scribes of the people and says, where is this child going to be born? I would suggest to you, is feigning ignorance. And I would tell you, this just occurred to me this last week. I think the reason he's so anxious about this child is because he knows the prophecy of Numbers 24. He's not a fool. He's not an idiot. He's king of the Jews. He's been in power since 37 BC. And he's dead by 4 BC, which then sort of pins the date of the birth of Jesus around 7 BC. Okay, 7 or 6 BC. So he's had ruling authority over the Jews and among the Jews for 3 decades. And I just don't think he's ignorant of the promise of Numbers 24. And that's the reason he gets so upset. And that's the reason he wants to kill this kid. Because this kid is not only a threat to his rule and reign, he's the one who's going to come with this scepter and exert this kingly authority in crushing the head of Moab and eradicating and dispossessing Edom, meaning Herod. So there's a lot of tension here in this thing, this emerging tension between Herod and the child. So, who are these people? They're these court officials with all of this training, all of this education in the customs and habits of possessed people or occupied peoples. And again, I'm speculating a bit, okay, but as they studied, these wise men, as they studied the Hebrew scriptures and came across these promises, not just the promise of Numbers 24, but a promise like Isaiah chapter 9. To us a child is born, to us a son is given. And the government will be upon his shoulder, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. Promises like that in the Hebrew scriptures, I'm convinced, captured their attention, captured their imagination. And you think about the kind of world that they had lived in, they had grown up in, the history of which they would have had great familiarity with. They're Persian, they're Babylonian, they're in that part of the world. That's where the Assyrians were. That's where the Babylonians were. That's where Tiglath-Pileser was. That's where Nebuchadnezzar was. That's where Darius the Mede and Cyrus were. And then things, of course, shift to Greece and Alexander, and then to Rome. And Caesar Augustus is now on the throne. Herod himself was a ruthless, bloodthirsty ruler. Had some of his own sons murdered because they posed threats to him. What's my point? My point is that these guys lived in a place that was anything but peaceful, and a history that was characterized by anything but peace. And folks, deep in your bones, you're just like these wise men. What you long for is what you were made for. You were made for shalom. You were made for peace, tranquility, for life that is full and whole. And so were they. So they come in contact with these promises. I mean, the one that emerges here, of course, is Numbers chapter 24. And they say they follow this star, verse 2. We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him.
For her who was in
Whoops.
You got it. Something came up.
We followed his star. Now I'm sure you've wondered about this. What's the nature of this star? And again, if you look at the commentaries, they'll talk about these strange alignments of planets involving Jupiter and Saturn and then particular stars and how they're configured. That sometimes it's suggested that this was some sort of astral phenomenon, a comet or something that zipped through the sky. Again, just thinking about this and reflecting on it, and given the language and the way the star is described in Matthew chapter 2, and the fact that in the scriptures, angels are referred to in a number of places as stars. Job 38:7, when the morning stars sang together, it isn't stars that sing, but the angels sang at the creation, right? I'm sure that that's what is referred to in Job 38. Daniel 8, verse 10 is a reference to angels using the language of a star. And then in Revelation, what do I have up there? Verse 10, the third angel blew his trumpet and a great star fell from heaven. Now that's a reference to a bad angel, but that angel that is cast down is described as a star. Revelation 22, verse 16, Jesus calls himself the bright and morning star. Jesus is not an angel, obviously, but my point is that rather than some sort of planetary or astral event, what I think is quite probable here is that this star was a supernatural phenomenon, not a natural phenomenon in the heavens, but a supernatural phenomenon. And that this star is actually an angel that appeared to these wise men. They were in the east. The star rose and they saw it in the west from the east, and they followed it. It guided them to Jerusalem. And then later in the text, verse 9, after listening to the king, they went on their way. And behold, the star that they had seen when it rose went before them. I mean, literally went before them, leading them until it came to rest over the place where the child was, the specific place where Jesus was with his mother and his father in the house. It's significant, too, that angels figure prominently in the Exodus, and I didn't write the passage up there, forgive me, but in Exodus, when the people encamp, the text, where is that? No, I'm sorry, I didn't write that one down. But the text in Exodus tells us that an angel encamped behind the people, between the people and Pharaoh and his assaulting army. So the angel of the Lord led Israel on its exodus. And so, the idea that this star is actually an angel, that this angel leads these wise men first to Jerusalem and then on to Bethlehem and to the specific place where Jesus is at this particular time seems to me to make the most sense of what's going on here. So, the star leads them, guides them. Angels, by the way, figure very prominently in the Matthew narrative, don't they? Angel appears to Joseph a couple of times. Angels appear prominently in Luke's account of the incarnation and the coming of Jesus. So that's